So I realize that if I actually stand in the front there, some of you won't be able to see the screen. So I'm going to be behind this little lot. I hope it's okay with you. As we will continue our series on why people are not a Christian and why, for many people, it doesn't seem to make sense. And we're going to be using that video that we saw really to just look at some themes which I think are prevalent in today's society regarding this whole thing about why Christianity doesn't make sense for so many people. So let's start with Nina. Okay, so Nina was talking about particularly the fact that for her, God doesn't seem knowable. Did you pick that up as we were going along? For Nina, God seemed to be a concept, something that was unknowable, not personal, not understandable. There seemed to be a huge gulf between her and whatever God might be. She said she was agnostic, which is you believe in something, but you don't know what, really. So this was the main reason for Nina why it just didn't make sense for her, because if you can't know a God, how can you know there's one there to start with and what they are like? And it's quite interesting with Nina, I think, that she comes from a Hindu background. And I haven't got time to go into Hinduism here, but the supreme god in Hinduism is Brahman, okay? And the key thing about Brahman is that he's unknowable. So I think this has kind of really influenced her in her upbringing, that if there is a God, he is unknowable. So the question is, if you were having coffee with Nina, if you were in conversation with her, if you're talking to her, what would you kind of say? Well, where would the conversation go? Well, I think probably I would just mention Jesus. I would just say, hey, in our faith, in the Christian faith, Jesus said some pretty amazing things that you have to explore and investigate. For example, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Without me, no one can get to God. If you had known me, you would have known God. But from now on, you do know God, and you have seen him. So Jesus was saying here to the disciples, now that you see me, you are actually seeing God. And it's possible to know God through me. So the conversation might go somewhere there if you were talking to Nina. But this morning, I don't want to talk about Nina. I just thought I'd use her as an introduction. I actually want to talk about Emily and ask what doesn't make sense for Emily, and Josh, what doesn't make sense for Josh. And I want to look at the two things. Well, actually, I only want to look at one. We won't have time to look at two. One of the main things that they both said didn't make sense for them. There was actually two categories that they both said didn't make sense for them. And the first one was the creation story, the 6 days of creation, as Josh described it. And then Emily mentioned the whole Adam and Eve story and said, it was a fairy story. They also both said that it's possible to be good and moral without God. Before I continue, can I just say I have complete sympathy with Josh and Emily. Really. I don't know about you, but I can understand why people don't believe. And I think that's actually helpful. To have an understanding of what doesn't make sense and why people don't believe. And what I want to do this morning is to have a look at this first category here, the creation story, and look particularly at the 6 days of creation, okay, and maybe get you to think a little bit broader on what might have been going on there when that story was written. Remember, Emily comes from a Catholic background, so she's had some probably exposure to this story. Josh was actually a Mormon. Again, haven't got time to go into Mormonism, only that Mormons believe that the Book of Mormon is as authoritative as the King James Version of the Bible. I say, won't go there. But we will go into this whole area of the creation story. So there are a number of interpretations of Genesis chapter 1, part of which Corey read. Okay, now the first interpretation is that we're talking in Genesis chapter 1 about a literal 6 days, that God created the world in 6 days, 6 24-hour periods. And I was brought up with this understanding of Genesis chapter 1. And to go with this particular interpretation, you really have to say that scientists are wrong, that geology is wrong, that biology is wrong as we understand those sciences today. And many Christians do genuinely believe that God created the world in 6 literal days. And you may too. Another view is that when you read about the word day in Genesis chapter 1, that word day in Hebrew is yom, and it can actually mean more than just a 24-hour literal period. It can mean a period of time. It can mean an expanse of time, an era, an epoch, something much wider and vast than 24 hours. So many Christians go with that and say, okay, that matches and marries more with science, biology, geology, and the evolutionary theory, and that is probably the best way to interpret Genesis chapter 1. Okay, that this word day is much wider, much bigger than a 24-hour period, and within that, God orchestrated the whole evolutionary bit. Okay, so that's a second way to interpret Genesis chapter 1. What I want to do this morning is actually give you a third way, which personally I believe makes great sense. I'm not asking you to buy into this third way. You may want to stick with either the first way or the second way, but I would just like to expose it to you, because whatever way we go with, we need to be able to talk with people like Josh and Emily about this kind of thing so that it makes sense. And I genuinely believe that the Bible is meant to make sense. Okay, so let's begin with this point. It's really important when you read Genesis, and Genesis chapter 1 in particular, to ask the question, what type of story is it? What type of literature or genre is it? And what was the intention of the person that wrote it? Now, that might have been Moses, or it might have been someone a little bit later on. But what was the intention originally of the person who wrote Genesis chapter 1? So we're kind of in this area, okay? Genesis was written in this area, which was called the ancient Near East in ancient times. And this area was called Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia included places like Canaan, which you might have heard of. And later on, it included places like Assyria and Babylonia, okay, which you may well have heard of too. It was a huge area, Mesopotamia, okay, and today includes countries like Israel and Palestine and Jordan and Syria and Iraq. Okay, so this is the area of the world we are talking about. And Genesis 1 was written between 2,500 and 3,500 years ago. Between 2,500 and 3,500 years ago. Now, here's the bit. At that time, there was another creation story that was doing the rounds. It was the prevailing creation story in that whole area. It was probably older than Genesis 1. Most scholars believe it was. And it was the story that kids would have been taught and people would have been brought up on. This was the creation story that everyone believed. And it was called Enuma Elish. Okay, it was called Enuma Elish. And it's found in this book, The Myths of Mesopotamia. The Myths of Mesopotamia. And when you read these myths, they feel a bit weird, because they are a bit weird. They're a bit like the Loch Ness Monster and things like that we looked at that earlier. But in the day, it was the belief, the bedrock of society, whether you were in Canaan or in Babylon. So, in the Enuma Elish, what you find is that there are lots of gods. Lots of gods indeed. And some gods go to war. Some gods are evil. They've got a dark side. You cannot trust the gods. The sun, moon, and planets are gods. You may have heard of Marduk. He is a sun god, a big god. In the Enuma Elish, the world is created from parts of a deposed dead god. So the world is created from a god's body parts. Okay? This is in this story. The gods have tried to re-establish order. So the order that we see here and now is the order they've tried to re-establish, but it's all pretty fragile and frail because the gods are a bit fickle and you never know what they're going to do next. And most importantly, the humans are created by an evil God. The blood of an evil God. And because we're created by the blood of an evil God, we are actually enslaved to him. Now, that's the story that everybody talked about and believed and that was in their schools. This was the story that Daniel would have been taught in Babylon. Okay, it was huge. It was big. And here is the thought. Could it just be that Genesis 1 is a writing with the intention of saying, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. It's a writing against the Enuma Elish that says this is what it's about. That actually there is one God. He is the creator God. There are no other gods. God is essentially good. God created stuff and he said, this is good. This is very good. That God is peaceful. That he is all-powerful and he creates by speaking. He is the one who brings order out of chaos. And is it just, and is it the case that the Genesis 1 is as it is in the days in order to show order? That God has an order. That he is not chaotic. That God is parental. That we are made in his image. That he is our Father. And that God loves us and wants us to prosper. If so, that is so different from the Enuma Elish. It's poles apart. And I just wonder whether the writer of Genesis is actually saying, you've got to know who God is. Because you've got it wrong up until this point. So, is it possible that actually Genesis 1 is not an attempt to tell us that the earth was created in 6 literal days? It is not an attempt to tell us how the earth was created at all. It's not meant to be read scientifically or viewed as anti-science, and is not meant to be read as a timeline. Because the writer of Genesis was wanting to get across the fact that God is one, and I've been through the list, haven't I, the differences, that God is completely different to the Mesopotamian God. That it's actually about themes, that Genesis 1 is about themes, and that we mustn't get stuck on a day actually being a 24-hour period, and that it was a creation poem with a teaching purpose. And that teaching purpose was to teach about God, God the creator. So it's not denying in any way that God is the creator. It's not denying any way that God is the God that we believe in at all. But what this way of interpreting is actually saying is that this is a beautiful piece of writing, a piece of poetry, if you like, that actually conveys truth of who God is and what he has done. And in this context, if you go with this, you can then start talking about Adam and Eve, which we will do in 2 weeks' time, okay? Because we haven't got time now. So I wanted to present this because I know that lots of people, young and old, have real trouble with Genesis chapter 1. And it's a stumbling block to people moving on in exploration of the Christian faith. They will start at the beginning of the Bible, and they will get stuck in Genesis 1. It needs to make sense. Even my own mother, who's 80, is talking to a lady whose husband died earlier this year because of COVID. And the one question that this lady has asked my mum is, what do you make of Genesis chapter 1 and Adam and Eve? It doesn't make sense, does it? So this, I think, is something that we really need to embrace. So the task this week is to do your own exploration. What do you believe about Genesis chapter 1? What is the interpretation you believe? Is it the 6 days? Is it the more longer view of the word day? Or is it this, that we're actually dealing with a piece of literature that was intended to convince others of the trueness of God?